It was the last week of October, and the air had thinned into that brittle sort of clarity that makes every sound carry further than it should. Even the bells seemed hesitant, as though aware they might scatter the few remaining leaves clinging to the chestnuts along the high. My coat was heavier than the day required, but I wore it for the same reason I sometimes keep an umbrella on a cloudless morning: habit and a reluctance to trust appearances. I had no business that afternoon, a rarity worth neither boasting about nor defending. I wandered down toward Christchurch Meadow, letting the cold do its quiet work on my thoughts. Somewhere between Magdalen Bridge and the slow curve of the Thames, I unfolded the Times, more from instinct than interest, and my eyes caught on an obituary for Dr. Julian Felton, Bishop of Witham. The name stirred the faintest memory, like an old book recalled by the scent rather than the story. Felton had been celebrated once, a preacher whose words, they said, could lift the mind without troubling the conscience. I remembered attending one of his sermons during my student days, dragged there by a fellow who claimed the bishop could make Leviticus sound like Milton. The memory was fragmentary: a tall figure in a high pulpit, the light from the clerestory windows falling in deliberate stripes across his robes, his voice patient and exacting. The obituary offered little beyond the ceremonial: dates, degrees, ecclesiastical appointments. It mentioned his retirement to a small rectory on the edge of Witham Woods, a life pared back to gardening, correspondence, and the occasional guest sermon. Near the meadow's entrance the water was low, and the bank smelled of wet silt. Across the Cherwell, a student choir was rehearsing in one of the college chapels, their voices travelling through the open window and carrying something of the season in them, a fragility that made the hairs at my neck rise. I leaned against the fence and let the music settle. The bishop's garden came to me then, unbidden. I'd never seen it, only imagined it from a passing remark years ago. Roses trained along a cloister wall, the borders clipped as neatly as his sermons. Perhaps it was the season that brought the thought, the garden stripped back, the roses clinging, colour draining from the leaves. I might have walked on without incident, had it not been for the old man kneeling in the border near the entrance to the dean's garden. He was pruning with the unhurried confidence of one who has been trusted with the same patch of earth for decades. His cap was pulled low, and his hands moved with a certainty that suggested they had been doing this before I was born. "You'll be missing him then," I said, nodding toward the roses. He glanced up without straightening, eyes the colour of wet slate. "Oh, the bishop." "Aye?" "Though not for the reasons the rest of them do." His voice was low, as if the hedges themselves might overhear. He paused, snipping away a thorned stem, and added, "Funny thing about a man of God. Sometimes it's what he got up to before God claimed him that's worth knowing." The remark slipped past me at first, as such things often do. Not because I wasn't listening, but because meaning is a slow creature, and I've learned not to frighten it into hiding by chasing too soon. I gave a polite nod, murmured something about the weather, and walked on. The choir's voices were clearer now, breaking into a harmony so fine it seemed barely woven together. But my mind had already drifted back to the gardener's words, turning them over like a coin with an unfamiliar engraving. Before God claimed him. There was a precision to that phrasing that troubled me. Most would have said before he took holy orders, or before he found his calling. This was different, as if God's claim was not so much a summoning as a reprieve, a last-minute redirection from some other life entirely. The thought lingered long after the music faded, following me through the meadow and up past the cloisters. I told myself it was nothing, a scrap of gossip embroidered by the mind of a man with nothing more pressing than roses to tend. Yet I have learned that it is often such scraps, the offhand remark, the throwaway clue in a crossword, that eventually thread themselves into the fabric of a case. That day I had no case, no suspicion, only a phrase, and the faintest outline of a man I had barely known. But even then, I think some part of me understood that the bishop's past had not been buried with him. The regal always seemed to me a place at odds with itself. By day it wore the tired face of a building half forgotten by fashion. By night, the gilded mouldings and faded red curtains made a gallant effort at remembering their former glory. I'd been there before, but not often, and never with the anticipation one associates with an evening's diversion. That night I had been persuaded, or rather cornered, into attending a lecture on Victorian morality, part of some Heritage Society's winter programme. The title had promised rigour and refinement. The reality was a droning recital of public statutes and moral injunctions, delivered by a man who appeared to resent both his subject and his audience. Lewis found me in the foyer afterwards, standing near the glass case that still displayed posters for films no longer showing. He looked almost relieved to see me, as though I might rescue him from some private ordeal. "You stayed the course then," he said, glancing at the programme in my hand. I told him I had, though not without the aid of a discreetly concealed crossword, which I had half finished during the speaker's excursion into the evils of music halls. We stepped outside into the damp air, the pavement still shining faintly from an earlier shower. Lewis hesitated, his expression carrying that blend of amusement and discomfort I had learned to recognise as the herald of a conversation he wasn't sure he ought to start. "There's a bit of something come up," he began, turning his collar up against the wind. "CID's been asked to, well, quietly have a look into the bishop's past." I must have frowned, for he added quickly, "Not official, more of a courtesy. Someone sent an anonymous letter to the chief superintendent, said they'd seen Felton, years back, mind you, at a club in Cowley, the sort that didn't advertise in the church circulars. Cowley had once had several such establishments, discreetly distant from the dreaming spires, but not so far that certain dons and visiting clergy couldn't find their way there. I asked him what sort of club it had been. "Burlesque," Lewis said after a moment, and the word sat in the air between us like an unclaimed parcel. He glanced at me to see if I'd make light of it, but I didn't. "There's more," he went on. "The letter came with a photograph, not a good one, grainy, poor light. Shows a young woman on stage, mid-act, and in the background, a man in a clerical collar." He reached into his coat and handed me an envelope. Inside, the photograph was smaller than I'd imagined, its edges worn, the blacks and greys bleeding into one another. The woman's face was half-turned, caught in the arc of movement, all feathered costume and shadow. Behind her, blurred but not beyond recognition, a figure stood near the stage's edge. The collar was stark against the dark suit, the features indistinct. "It could be anyone," I said, though even as I spoke I knew the line of the shoulders, the particular set of the head, carried the ghost of familiarity. "The club's gone now," Lewis said. "Shut down years ago. Place was called the Gilded Lily. The name seemed almost too on the nose, like something lifted from the very moralist diatribe we'd just endured." I slipped the photograph back into its envelope and returned it to him. "And what exactly," I asked, "are we meant to be looking for?" "That's just it," Lewis replied. "No one's saying. It's not about prosecuting anything, nothing like that. More about clearing the air, or deciding whether it needs to be cleared at all." We stood for a moment, watching the last of the audience disperse into the night. The rain began again, fine as sifted flour, blurring the street lamps into pale halos. "A certain sort of past clings," I said at last, almost to myself, "no matter how it's dressed or how far one tries to walk from it." Lewis said nothing. He had learned, as I had, that some remarks are best left to find their own resting place. As we parted at the corner, I felt the weight of the photograph still in my mind. Not the woman, not the stage, but the indistinct man behind her. It was the way he seemed to be watching nothing in particular, as the porter at Witham College directed me through 2 quadrangles, their lawns dulled by frost, to the Dean's Rooms. The building smelled faintly of coal dust and floor polish, as though reluctant to admit the century had turned. Reverend Samuel Keating answered my knock himself. He was tall in that spare way that suggests a life of regular walks and careful appetites, his clerical collar fastened as neatly as the crease in his trousers. He ushered me to a chair without ceremony, offering neither tea nor the pretence of small talk. I had the sense of a man who liked to arrive quickly at the point, provided it was his point. "You're here about Julian," he said, steepling his fingers. I nodded. He was beyond reproach. I won't indulge baseless tittle-tattle from nameless sources. Keating's voice was firm, but his eyes drifted past me to the mullioned window, where a few reluctant leaves clung to the beech beyond the quad. I mentioned that certain questions had been raised, a photograph, nothing more at present, and I watched a faint tremor cross his expression. It was not shock, It was the fleeting calculation of a man deciding whether to deny too strongly or not quite enough. Photograph, he repeated, with an edge of weariness. I don't propose to dignify gossip with specifics. Julian Felton served God with dignity for half a century. That is what remains. And yet, I said, what remains is not always all that was. We let the silence sit. The ticking of a small carriage clock on his desk seemed to amplify in the stillness. I asked if I might see the bishop's old study more from instinct than any clear expectation. Keating hesitated, then stood and led me along a narrow passage lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow us, as though mildly curious about our errand. The study was small, its shelves sagging slightly under the weight of theological commentaries and slender volumes of verse. The air was tinged with the scent of dust and something older, perhaps the residue of a long-ago fire. On the desk lay an open Bible, its pages edged with the faint brown tide marks of age. I turned it idly, and a slip of card fell to the floor. It was a theatre ticket, pressed flat as a flower, the ink faded but legible. Eden Club, one night only. The date, 1974. The club's name was printed in looping gilt, the sort of ornament that makes no secret of its intentions. Keating watched me pick it up. A bookmark, perhaps, he said lightly, though his tone lacked conviction. Julian often kept odd scraps in his books. Odd indeed, I thought, for a man of the cloth to keep a ticket for a place whose reputation, even in its day, had been known far beyond Cowley Road. I slipped it back between the pages without comment. Lewis arrived then, bringing with him the faint smell of the archives, a dry blend of paper, glue, and the patience of generations. He placed a slim, leather-bound diary on the desk. The year embossed on its spine was 1974. We opened it together. The first half of the year was intact, entries in a small, neat hand, appointments, sermon notes, the occasional weather remark. But from late June to early September the pages had been neatly removed, not torn but excised with a blade, the binding unfrayed, the absence deliberate. Keating said nothing, though I saw his fingers tighten slightly on the back of a chair. After a moment he turned away, fussing with the curtains, though the light was already dimming. Missing pages are curious things, I said, half to Lewis. Sometimes they're gone because they never mattered, sometimes because they mattered too much. The Dean's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly as though he might speak, but no words came. I had the sense that something unsaid was pressing at him, like a faint knocking from another room. We left soon after, the Bible and its press ticket still resting on the desk. The diary returned to Lewis's coat. Outside, the air had turned sharper, the sky rinsed to a pale metal. I thought of the Eden Club, of the bishop in 1974, and of the weeks carefully excised from his record. And I thought, not for the first time, how often holiness is remembered in whole cloth, when in truth it is patched from fragments. The rain had not stopped all morning, a fine, persistent drizzle that seemed less concerned with soaking than with reminding one of its presence. I had taken refuge in a small tea-room off Walton Street, the sort of place where the teaspoons still bore the initials of some long-defunct proprietor, and the scones were more sincere than successful. She was seated 2 tables away, back straight, the pale crown of her hair arranged with the kind of care that belongs to a past profession. In front of her lay a well-thumbed copy of The Waste Land, its spine softened by years. She read without hurry, as though she had walked these lines many times before, and was simply checking that Eliot had not altered them in her absence. Our eyes met briefly when I set my cup down too heavily, and she gave the faintest smile, not of invitation, but of a shared understanding that wet afternoons in Jericho were best endured in company. I asked if she minded me joining her, and she inclined her head in a way that was neither eager nor reluctant. We spoke first of the weather, as the English must, then of poetry. She said she had always preferred 4 quartets, though she suspected The Waste Land was the greater work. Her voice had the unhurried clarity of someone trained to project without raising it. When I asked if she had taught, she told me she was a retired ballet instructor, Margaret Ashcombe. There was a poise to her stillness, a residual choreography in the way she reached for her cup. Our conversation drifted across cities she had lived in, theatres she had visited, and the strange half-life of performance once the stage is left behind. There was nothing in her manner to suggest the Eden Club, or any of its more flamboyant entertainments. It was Lewis, later that evening, who supplied the missing detail. He had made a few calls unobtrusively to an old contact who had known Cowley's nightlife in the 70s. Margaret Ashcombe, before she became a ballet instructor, had performed under another name, Celeste Marvel. Her act, he said, had been well regarded for its precision and its irony. A lithe, deliberate parody of ecclesiastical ceremony, complete with a bishop's mitre. The next afternoon I returned to the tea-room. She was there again, seated at the same table, this time with Anna Karenina and a pot of Darjeeling. I mentioned, lightly, that I had heard she had once worked the stage. She did not start, only adjusted her cup slightly on its saucer. "Ah," she said, "so you've been making enquiries?" I asked if she remembered a particular night in 1974, when the Eden Club hosted a one-off performance. Her smile deepened, but it was a smile of private amusement, as if at some half-forgotten in-joke. "Oh, I remember it," she said. "The house was full, the air thick with perfume and smoke. But the bishop I met that night was not Julian Felton. I asked how she could be so certain. Because, she said, placing her cup down with precision, I spent the better part of an hour talking to him afterwards. And because he told me his name, which was not Felton. She would not give the name, only that he had been charming in a diffident way, and that his interest in her act had been more theatrical than personal. I asked if she had seen Felton in later years. "Only in the papers," she replied. He had one of those faces one doesn't forget, and I would have known him. There was a silence then, filled by the clink of china and the low hum of other conversations. I wondered whether she was protecting the memory of someone else, or simply enjoying the small power that comes from withholding. When I left, she returned to her book without farewell. On the pavement outside, the rain had eased, though the air still held the scent of wet stone. Lewis was waiting in the car. "Well?" he asked. "She says it wasn't him," I told him. "And do you believe her?" I looked back through the steamed glass at the poised figure in the corner. "I believe she believes it," I said, "and sometimes that is all the truth we get." The Randolph was one of those Oxford institutions whose carpets had grown accustomed to absorbing more secrets than stains. The front desk had been polished by a century of elbows and quiet transactions, its brass bells dulled to a warm patina. I had arranged to meet him, Mr. Colling, retired now, in the lounge, where the chairs still sagged slightly in the way of furniture that has overheard too much. He arrived with a cane, though I suspected he leaned on it more from habit than necessity. His eyes were small but keen, the sort that had once missed nothing coming through those revolving doors. "You're after the bishop, then," he said without preamble, as though the years since his service had been little more than an intermission. "Not the bishop as such," I told him. "The man before he was the bishop." Colling smiled faintly, settling into the chair opposite. "Oh, I remember him. Not so much the collar as the way he wore his plain clothes, like he'd borrowed them for the day. Would come in from the cold with that look, as if the world outside was an inconvenience he'd been obliged to endure. He visited often, from time to time, mid-70s mostly, always the same routine. Arrive late afternoon, coat collar turned up, carrying nothing more than a slim case. 10 minutes later, a lady would join him, well turned out. Dark hair, striking face. They'd sit in the corner of the lounge, low voices, never long enough to draw much attention. Then off they'd go into the night. A pause. He was watching me to see if I'd judge the man. I didn't. One night in particular, Colling went on, there was an incident. He'd come down alone, looking unsettled. In the lobby, an older gentleman was waiting for him. No pleasantries. They went straight to it. Not shouting, mind, but that kind of low argument where the quiet makes it sharper. Do you recall what was said? Not much, just a word here and there. But I caught a name. Keating. The sound of it seemed to linger in the room longer than it should. "You're sure?" "Oh, yes. Clear as anything." The older man said something like, "Keating warned you," or "Keating told you this would happen. And your bishop, well, your future bishop, has said nothing at all. Just stared at the floor until the other man left." What happened after? Colling shifted in his chair. He went up to his room, stayed there until the morning. Checked out early. Didn't see him for a long while after that. We spoke a while longer, but his account did not vary. No embellishments, no convenient details to please a listener. Just the picture of a man, younger then, not yet sanctified by office, moving in and out of a life that the Dean, Reverend Keating, would apparently have preferred remain unmentioned. As I left the Randolph, the afternoon light was already fading, the rain clouds gathering in slow procession over the rooftops. The street lamps were coming on, halos forming in the damp air. Keating. I had met men who could speak a denial with such conviction that one almost wanted to believe them. But the Dean's reaction in his rooms at Witham, that hesitation at the photograph, had been too quick to hide. Now, with Colling's recollection, it began to look less like reflex and more like history. The notion settled into me like the first bar of a piece of music whose melody I did not yet know. If Felton had been warned by Keating, then the Dean's disapproval of baseless tittle-tattle was not the defence of a spotless colleague, but the reflex of a man protecting something shared. I walked down Beaumont Street, the smell of wet leaves rising from the gutters, and considered how easily one can walk into a story from the wrong end, seeing only its conclusion and none of the turns that led there. The bishop's life had been sewn into the fabric of the college's memory as if it had always been one seamless cloth, but seams can be unpicked, and I had begun to see the first loose thread. Lewis found me in the CID office just after lunch, the weather outside caught between rain and snow, the pavements slick as slate. He laid a manila envelope on my desk with the deliberate care of someone setting down a sleeping child. "Another photo," he said. "Eden Club again." I drew it out and saw immediately the difference. This was no blurred ghost in the wings. The stage lights had found their mark, and the clergyman stood nearer the foreground, half-turned toward the performer. The collar gleamed white against the dark cloth, and though the image was grainy with age, the shape of the jaw, the line of the brow, carried a troubling familiarity. Forensics had given it a cautious verdict, possible match to Felton, with caveats about the limitations of enlargements from poor stock. Possible was enough to start a theory turning in my mind. I laid it out for Lewis as we drove. The bishop had been indiscreet in his youth, not criminal, but compromising enough to damage a reputation if it surfaced. Keating, knowing of it, had intervened, removed the dangerous pages from the diary, and kept the matter quiet for decades. Now, someone with access to the old photographs was stirring the ashes, seeing what kind of fire might be coaxed to life. Lewis was unconvinced. "You think the Dean's just been shielding him all these years?" "I do," I said, "and if I'm right, then the anonymous letter is less about truth than leverage." We parked near Walton Street, where the tea room still glowed against the damp grey of the afternoon. Margaret Ashcombe was in her usual corner, a small pot of Assam beside her, reading something in French. She looked up as we entered, her expression registering neither surprise nor displeasure. "You've brought a friend," she said, glancing at Lewis. I slid the photograph across the table. She studied it for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge, then smiled in that slow, private way of hers. "Ah, yes, that. You remember the night?" I asked. She set the photo down carefully as though it might bruise. "Of course. But you've got the wrong bishop." The line had the neatness of a rehearsed joke, but she didn't laugh. "That's not Felton," she continued. "That's Edward Pike, an actor. He was in a touring play about Thomas Becket. The Eden Club thought it would be amusing to stage a photograph with one of their girls and a man dressed as a bishop. Publicity, you see. We did a whole series. Bishop in the audience, bishop backstage, bishop at the bar. It was all theatre." She took a sip of her tea, watching me over the rim. I asked why she hadn't mentioned this before. "Because," she said, "you didn't ask the right question. You wanted to know if I'd met Felton that night." I hadn't. Lewis looked at me, then at the photograph, as if hoping the image might change its story if stared at long enough. "You're certain?" I pressed. "I spent 2 years on tour with Edward Pike," she said. "I think I know his face." The theory I'd been building, brick by cautious brick, began to tilt in my mind. The careful logic, Felton's indiscretion, Keating's cover-up, the present-day exploitation, was suddenly weightless, a scaffold without the building it was meant to support. Margaret pushed the photograph back toward me. "The trouble with old pictures," she said, "is that they show you exactly what was there, and nothing of what it meant. When we left, the light had gone, leaving the streets under a thin rain that silvered the cobblestones. Lewis was quiet until we reached the car. So, not Felton? Not Felton, I said, which means we're back where we started. Not quite, I thought. The photograph might have been a red herring, but someone had chosen to send it. Someone who knew its ambiguity would tempt a certain conclusion, and that, in its own way, was more deliberate than truth. The solicitor's office was in one of those narrow brick terraces just off St Aldate's, the kind where the windows were half obscured by curling paper notices and the doorbell had to be pressed twice before it admitted you. Inside, the air was heavy with old wool and older ledgers. The man behind the desk read the will aloud in the dry manner of someone reciting train times. Most of it was as one might expect. Modest provisions for the church, a few named charities, small sums to distant relations. And then Caroline Dore, Headington, a legacy of £2,000. There was no explanation in the text, just the name, the address and the figure. A sum too small to be charity, too deliberate to be accident. Lewis drove. The afternoon was damp but bright, a strange watery light lying over the suburbs. Headington's streets felt curiously suspended between village and city, narrow lanes that gave way without warning to post-war houses, the occasional privet hedge still stubbornly green. Number 12 was a semi-detached, with a garden that looked recently tended, though the gate creaked in protest when I pushed it. She answered the door herself. Late 60s, perhaps, hair pinned with more practicality than style, eyes sharp in a way that suggested they had not yet softened to strangers. "Mrs. Dore," I said. "Yes." We told her our interest was connected to the bishop's will. She stiffened. "I don't know anything about that man," she said flatly. "Yet your name is there," I said, "and a bequest." Her mouth thinned. "Then there's been a mistake. Good day." She was already closing the door when I noticed, just beyond her shoulder, a photograph on the wall. Framed in simple wood, glass catching the light. Two figures, decades younger, arm in arm. The man in a dark suit, his head turned slightly toward her. "Julian Felton," I remarked on the picture. She stepped into the gap between me and the hall, her voice suddenly tight. "That's my late husband." It was not. We withdrew, though I felt her eyes on us until the car door shut. Lewis was quiet until we turned onto the main road. Then he said, "You recognized her?" "Not at first. But I've seen that face before, not in photographs, but in the old staff lists at Witham. She was a secretary there, mid-70s. I had him check the archives. It took less than an hour for him to confirm it. Caroline Dore, née Sykes. Employed at Witham from 1972 until her dismissal in the spring of 1975. The file was slim, the official note brief. Terminated for breach of conduct. No detail, no elaboration. The sort of euphemism institutions use when they hope the matter will quietly die in the records. Dismissals of that kind in that era were rarely about accounting errors. The year, 1975, placed it squarely in the shadow of the missing diary pages, the Eden Club ticket, and the bishop's occasional visits to Oxford in plain clothes. I walked that evening through the rain-darkened streets back toward my flat, the image of the photograph fixed in my mind. Felton had looked relaxed in it, unguarded, his hand resting lightly on hers. Not the posture of a formal acquaintance, nor the calculated stiffness of a posed public image. A modest bequest, years later, to a woman who had been dismissed under a cloud. Enough to suggest obligation or guilt, but not enough to speak of enduring intimacy. The sum was the sort one leaves when conscience pricks, but memory has cooled. If Caroline Dore had once been part of whatever affair had unsettled the bishop's youth, she was not prepared to revive it. But the photograph on her wall told me the past had already found her, whether she chose to acknowledge it or not. The tape recorder clicked faintly as the bishop's voice filled the cramped office. It was the slow, deliberate cadence Morse had always associated with ecclesiastical sermons, measured enough to let each word sink into the congregation's mind, yet just brisk enough to avoid tedium. "By the rivers of Cherwell there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion." Morse stopped the machine and frowned. His finger hovered over the rewind button. He pressed it, wound the tape back a few seconds, and listened again. Cherwell, not Babylon. It was the sort of deviation most people wouldn't notice, perhaps chalked up to a slip of the tongue. But Morse's ear, attuned to words the way some men are to wine, caught the deliberate substitution. And Cherwell was not a word one accidentally inserted. The Cherwell ran past Witham's green meadows, through Oxford's heart. Lewis glanced up from the desk opposite. "Something wrong with it, sir?" "Not wrong, Lewis, just not right." Morse rewound the tape once more, letting the words settle like silt in water. "You see, Psalm 137 begins by the rivers of Babylon. The bishop says Cherwell. He does it without hesitation. That's no mistake. It's a signal." Lewis raised an eyebrow. "To who?" Morse didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the bishop's personal Bible, the one they'd taken from his study at Witham. The leather binding creaked faintly as he flipped through its onion skin pages. Near the Psalms, he found it, a fine pencil annotation, almost invisible unless you tilted the page towards the light. By the rivers of Cherwell, and beside it, in smaller script, M. Ashcombe, Final Dance. The air in the office seemed to tighten. Morse sat back, his lips pressing together in thought. Margaret Ashcombe, who had been so careful, so poised in their conversation at the tea-room, who had denied Felton's presence at the Eden Club, steering them towards the explanation of an actor. And yet— "Sir," Lewis prompted. "I think our dear bishop left himself a breadcrumb trail," Morse said, "hidden in plain sight for those with ears to hear." That afternoon, the rain came down in a slow, relentless drizzle. Morse walked to Jericho with his collar turned up, the bishop's Bible tucked under his arm. He found Margaret at her usual corner table, a teapot steaming gently before her, Eliot open in front of her as though it were a shield. "Morse," she said, her tone one of faint resignation. "I had a feeling I might see you again." Morse placed the Bible on the table and opened it to the marked page. "You knew Felton well enough that he would alter scripture for you." Her fingers tightened slightly on her teacup, but she said nothing. "This note," Morse went on, tapping the pencil mark, "links you to the bishop's, well, let's call it his more colourful years. Final Dance. Was that at the Eden Club?" For a long moment, the only sound was the soft clink of crockery from the counter. Finally she exhaled. "It was not a scandal to him, Inspector. It was a kindness. I was leaving the stage for good that night. He came to wish me well. That was all. Yet he remembered you, and the night, for the rest of his life." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "We all remember our youth differently, Mr. Morse. He chose to hide his in psalms and sermons. Perhaps I chose to hide mine in half-truths." Morse studied her for a moment. There was no hint of mockery, no coyness now, just the quiet dignity of someone who had made her peace with the past, even if the rest of the world had not. When he rose to leave, she placed a hand on the open Bible and slid it towards him. "Keep it," she said. "If you're going to follow his trail, you'll need it." Outside, the rain had not let up. Morse stood for a moment under the awning, the Bible heavy in his hand, the misquoted psalm echoing in his mind. Whatever truth lay ahead, it was wrapped not in sin or virtue, but in memory, the sort that never quite fades, however far one thinks they've walked from it. It arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, slid under the frosted glass of Morse's office door as if from an unseen hand. The envelope was cream, expensive, its flap sealed with a faint trace of lavender wax. No return address. Morse slit it open with the edge of a library card. Inside, a single sheet of heavy paper bearing the same neat type as the first letter. "The Dean is not without stain. He has been the keeper of more than Scripture. Ask him about the poem. Ask him about who inspired it." Below, neatly folded, was a photocopy of a handwritten poem. It was untitled, written in the measured, looping script Morse had already seen in the bishop's correspondence. The verses were tender, almost painfully so, and spoke of moonlight, music, and the cool darkness before the curtain falls. Morse read it twice, then a third time, his eyes narrowing. The watermark of the paper showed faintly in the desk lamp's light. Wytham College, Senior Common Room. "Well, that narrows it," Lewis said, when Morse passed it across the desk. He was perched on the edge of a chair, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Means whoever sent it works there, or at least has access." "Or had access," Morse replied, leaning back. "Paper like this doesn't change much. Could have been nicked years ago. Still. Lewis tilted his head. And the dean's name's in the frame now? Morse tapped the poem with a finger. Not directly, but the bishop's handwriting, unmistakable. If this was addressed to a woman and the dean knew of it, he could be protecting her. Or himself. The silence stretched. Outside, in the quad, a few students crossed in raincoats, heads down against the drizzle. Lewis broke it. Margaret Ashcombe? Morse's expression didn't change, though the corner of his mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. She claimed the bishop she met wasn't Felton. She admitted to a staged photograph. Yet she's dodged every question that brushes close to 1974. And now, he gestured at the poem, we have a love note, or a confession. Either way, something worth keeping in the shadows. They took the letter and poem to Wytham College that afternoon. The senior common room was warm, the air scented faintly of polish and pipe smoke. A pair of lecturers murmured over sherry by the fire. Morse drifted to the writing table in the corner, running his hand along the neat stacks of stationery. The watermark matched perfectly. Reverend Keating entered with the unhurried grace of a man confident in his position. His eyes darted to the letter in Morse's hand. "I see," he said, before Morse had even spoken. "Another one?" "You've received one?" Morse asked. "Only the first, some weeks ago. I thought it beneath comment. I expect the same anonymous hand is at work here." Morse handed him the poem. Keating read it, face composed, then returned it without a flicker. "I fail to see the relevance." "And yet," Morse said mildly, "you removed certain pages from the bishop's diary for 1974. Pages that might tell us who this was written for." Keating's pause was so slight, Lewis might have missed it. "Those pages were missing when the diary came to me. I assumed they had been misplaced years ago." "Or," Morse said, his gaze steady, "destroyed." The dean's voice cooled. "Inspector, I will not dignify gossip. Julian Felton was a friend. His ministry, his life, deserves respect." As they left, Morse lingered in the hallway, watching the rain streak the tall windows. "He's lying," he said softly, "and I think our poised ballerina knows exactly why." That evening, Morse walked to Margaret Ashcombe's small terraced house in Jericho. She opened the door at once as though expecting him. "Another letter," Morse said, without preamble. Her eyes flickered, not with surprise, but recognition. "Someone wants the past exhumed, Inspector," she said, her voice level. "But sometimes it's better left buried. Don't you think?" Morse didn't answer. He was looking past her, to a side table where a single sheet of Wytham College stationery lay beside a silver pen. Morse leaned back in the creaking chair of his flat, the day's conversations still looping in his mind like the refrain of a half-remembered song. Margaret Ashcombe's words had the air of a confession rehearsed but incomplete, the sort of story designed to be the final truth, neat enough to satisfy, human enough to be plausible. She had spoken plainly, her hands clasped around a cooling cup of Earl Grey, about a brief, tender affair with Julian Felton in the summer of 1974. She had painted it as a dalliance between two lonely people, Felton, young and still unsure of his calling. She, a dancer who knew the fleeting nature of her own career. It had ended without rancour, she claimed, each returning to their own lives. But the real scandal, she insisted, had never been hers to own. That belonged to Reverend Samuel Keating, then a young curate at Wytham, and Caroline Dorr, the college secretary. He adored her, Margaret had said, her eyes searching Morse's for some flicker of judgment, and when she was dismissed, it nearly broke him. Morse could almost see the shape of it, the small college in the mid-70s, the rigid boundaries of clerical conduct, the whispered accusations that could undo a man's future. Keating had survived, eventually rising to dean. Caroline had vanished into Headington obscurity. Lewis, listening in, had been quietly satisfied. "That would explain the bishop's will, sir," a bit of hush money, years later. "Yes," Morse had replied, "it would." And yet, the explanation settled uneasily in his mind, like a painting hung fractionally askew. Now, alone in the dim light of his flat, Morse poured himself a scotch and opened the bishop's diary, the battered, calf-bound volume Lewis had recovered from the archives. Most of 1974 and 1975 were gone, whole months sliced out with a blade, leaving only ragged stubs. But there were fragments. One page, from October 1974, remained intact. The neat, precise handwriting stood out against the cream paper. Thursday. Confession. No elaboration, no name. But the date was the same night stamped on the faded theatre ticket found in the Bishop's Bible. Eden Club, one night only. Morse frowned, swirling the scotch in his glass. If Felton had written confession on that night, then Margaret's tidy version of events, a summer romance ending quietly, was already unravelling. Confession implied guilt, implied a sin unspoken until then. And if the bishop's sermon, decades later, could bend scripture to slip in a reference to the Cherwell, perhaps he had been weaving his past into his work all along. The problem was knowing which past. A siren wailed faintly somewhere in the city. Morse set the diary down and stared at the ceiling, the patterns of cracked plaster as tangled as his thoughts. Felton, Margaret, Keating, Caroline. The names circled each other in his mind like chess pieces waiting for a move. If Margaret was telling the truth about Keating's affair, why shield the Dean now? If she was lying, why risk giving Morse a story that could be dismantled so easily? He lit a cigarette and thought of the anonymous letters, one naming Felton, the second pointing directly at Keating, both written by someone with access to the senior common room stationery. Whoever it was knew enough to wound reputations, but not enough, or not willing, to deliver a killing blow. That suggested motive beyond simple spite. Morse exhaled smoke slowly. Confession, the Eden Club, missing diary pages, a bequest in a will, and somewhere in that knot, a truth still hiding. The telephone rang, making him jump. It was Lewis. "Sir, bit of a development. The night porter from the Randolph just called me back. He remembered something else about that argument he overheard in 74. Said it wasn't Keating Felton was rowing with. It was another clergyman. A bishop's chaplain at the time. Name of Shaw." Morse's fingers tightened on the receiver. Shaw. The name had not appeared in any of their inquiries, and suddenly the neat little picture Margaret had offered seemed not just incomplete, but entirely the wrong frame. The garden was much as Morse remembered it from his first visit, neat, restrained, yet with a sense of cultivated secrecy. August light slanted through the beech trees, painting the lawn in shifting lattices. The air smelled faintly of boxwood and old stone. Morse walked slowly along the gravel path, hands in pockets, listening to the crunch beneath his shoes. The Dean was already waiting at the bench by the sundial, a flask beside him. "Inspector," Keating said, the word carrying the mild resignation of someone expecting an unpleasant conversation. Morse sat without being asked. "I thought we might revisit our discussion about the bishop." Keating regarded the sundial for a moment. "The past," he said quietly, "is never as past as one hopes." "You've had a letter," Morse said. It wasn't a question. Keating's eyes flickered, just enough to confirm it. "I'll tell you what I think," Morse went on. "Felton wasn't at the Eden Club for pleasure. He was there for you." The Dean's fingers tightened on the edge of the bench. "Go on." "Caroline Dorr. You knew her in 75, more than knew her, and when she became pregnant." Keating drew a sharp breath. "Felton took the blame, said he was involved, gave you room to continue your career. The college found funds to resettle her, and the meeting at the Eden Club was to finalize arrangements." Keating was silent for a long moment, gaze fixed on the sundial's shadow creeping over the numerals. When he spoke, his voice was low, stripped of the clipped authority Morse had always associated with him. "It was my first parish post. I thought I understood temptation, Inspector. I thought it was all theoretical, something for sermons. Caroline was intelligent, quick-witted, and lonely. Her husband had died the year before, a road accident." He rubbed his forehead. "It was my doing. I don't excuse it. When she told me about the child, I was ready to resign, but Felton wouldn't have it. Said I was young, that the church needed more than martyrs to their own mistakes. He offered to carry the scandal. The college bursar arranged the funds. Caroline went away. The child was adopted by a family in Somerset. And you never saw her again." "I wrote once." She replied, "Once. That was all. The bishop, he never spoke of it again. not even privately. Morse leaned back, letting the story settle into place like the last piece of a jigsaw. And the letters? Keating's lips compressed. From the child. Grown now. She works here in the senior library. Clever girl. Clever enough to get hold of Felton's handwriting from the archives to make her letters sting. She thinks I abandoned her. Perhaps she's right. But she won't speak to me. Morse thought of the quiet figure he'd seen shelving books during his first visit to Witham, the young woman with the pale, guarded face who'd barely looked up when he passed. Why come clean to me now? Keating gave a faint, mirthless smile. Because the truth will out, Inspector. Always. Better that it comes from my lips than from another poisoned letter. They sat in silence for a while. The beech leaves stirred overhead, their whisper like the rustle of turning pages. You'll want to speak with her, Keating said at last. Yes, Morse replied. She won't make it easy. Few worthwhile things are, Morse murmured, rising. As he walked back along the path, Morse felt no triumph in the revelation. The pieces fitted, but the picture they formed was less a solved puzzle than a portrait of compromises, sacrifices and quiet lingering. Wounds. Felton, Keating, Caroline, and the child who had grown up with only half a story. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the Eden Club, a place now gone to dust, yet still casting shadows over Oxford's golden stone. The junior librarian sat at a low desk in the college's oak-panelled reading room, the faint dust of old paper hanging in the air. When Morse approached, she looked up with a start, her eyes wide behind round spectacles. For a moment she resembled a cornered animal, ready to bolt. Miss Daw, he began softly, or should I say, Miss Caroline Daw's daughter. Her face flushed instantly, a tell in the quiet half-light. The reading room was empty save for a clock ticking with ponderous regularity. She set her fountain pen down with careful precision, then folded her hands. "You've read them?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but the edges trembled. Morse nodded. Everyone, and the bishop's diary, and the dean's confession. For a long while she said nothing. A church bell sounded faintly in the quadrangle, then she drew a breath. I only wanted them to admit it, to stop living like none of it ever happened. Morse took the seat opposite her. And the letters? You thought the threat of scandal would force the truth out? It wasn't about scandal, she said sharply, the first real flash of heat in her voice. It was about my mother. She lived her life in the shadow of that man, not Bishop Felton, but Dean Keating. He let her think she was nothing more than an indiscretion to be tidied away. And Bishop Felton, he played the good friend, but he kept the secret for him. She looked down, tracing a finger along the grain of the desk. I thought maybe if the truth was out, she could have some peace. Morse studied her for a moment. She was younger than he had expected, early 30s at most. Yet there was a hardness about her eyes that spoke of old grievances worn smooth through repeated handling. "And what peace do you get out of it?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, and Morse decided not to press. "Miss Daw," he said, rising slowly, "I think we've had enough tears and headlines for one lifetime. If you don't send any more letters, I doubt anyone will wish to make formal complaints. The bishop's gone. The dean will retire soon. You can choose to carry this, or you can put it down." Her lip trembled, just slightly. "Do you believe in forgiveness, Inspector?" He looked away towards the dusty shafts of light falling across the desk. "Sometimes, but I've never found it in a courtroom." Later, Morse sat alone in his corner of the King's Arms. The pub was quiet, a low murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of glassware, the smell of malt rising from his pint. Lewis had gone home hours earlier. The crossword from that morning's paper lay folded beside him, the last stubborn clue still unsolved. Stripper's mark, 5 letters. He sipped his beer, thinking of the bishop in his study, the careful script in the diary, the deliberate misquotation of the psalm. The word came suddenly, as if whispered in his ear. Mitre. A faint smile played on his lips. A mitre, the headpiece of a bishop, and in another life the name for a sort of cutting tool. A stripper's mark, depending on one's trade. Crossed clues indeed. Morse thought of Felton, Julian, not as a prelate in mitre and cope, but as the young man glimpsed in faded photographs, a man who had loved unwisely, lied artfully and chosen loyalty over purity, and Keating, haunted not by the sin but by the debt, and Caroline Dore, who had lived with the consequence while others wore the robes. The crossword was complete now, yet the answers in his casebook felt less so. As he drained his pint, he wondered if that was the point, that life, like a good puzzle, left its share of clues forever unsolved. He folded the paper carefully and rose, the smile still there, but touched with melancholy. Outside, Oxford's night air was cool, and the lamps cast long shadows across the cobbles. Somewhere in the dark a bell struck the hour, and Morse walked on, hands deep in his pockets, the quiet compromises of other people's lives echoing in his thoughts.